And at the beginning of the book, we talk about why stories are so powerful. Storytelling is powerful traditionally because it's so universal. And I like this quote from Elie Wiesel, who's a French Nobel Prize-winning author, who said, "God made man because he loves stories." And I use this quote to just kind of convey the fact that storytelling has been around since the beginning, and it's what human beings do. It's what separates human beings from all the other animals of the world. And if God created man because he loves stories, he created a storytelling animal. So that's one of the first points that we try to make. And I think one of the things I looked for when I started doing research for this book was companies who were telling stories in email, and companies that were beginning to tell stories using social media. And this company happens to be one of my favorite companies in the sense that I own one of their bicycles. They make folding bicycles, and they make folding bicycles that you can take anywhere. And so I've been getting their emails for the last 10 years. And even 10 years ago, they were telling stories in their email. They were asking people, what have you done that's interesting on your Bike Friday? And what kind of things can you do with it? And then they take the best stories and they send them out in newsletter form. And what I found interesting about this is, even if you just think about email, without thinking about social or storytelling, what happens? We all get too much email, and we all get a lot of spam, and we all like to delete things. This is a company that for the past 10 years, when I get their monthly newsletter, I open it, because I know it tells a good story, okay? And I think that's a real, kind of a bit of a revelation to me. First, I'd like to, I thought we had another slide, but go ahead. Okay. I'll tell you about some of the stories they tell. They tell stories about exotic things. A woman who was taking her bicycle for 2 months all over Japan and just riding the trains. But they also tell stories about people who use Bike Fridays in their daily lives. And what's interesting is Bike Friday is not telling you what a great product they make. They're letting the community speak for them. And I think that's the first thing we ought to focus on, is letting the community speak for us. Okay, so another thing that I took a quote from Scott Bedbury, who actually conceived the Just Do It campaign for Nike and was instrumental in making Starbucks an international brand. He says that stories create the emotional context people need to locate themselves in a larger experience. If you think about a company like Bike Friday, they've got their community telling stories, and other people are seeing themselves in those stories. And those stories are triggering other stories in the minds of the users, and those stories are giving meaning to the community. Because really that's what a community is. A community is a group of people that shares meaning in a larger context. So, thinking about all these things and just looking for some examples, I think there are companies out there already starting to do this, but I think we're not far from the beginning of this movement. Because mostly what I see is people saying, we can blast out our messages on email, or we can use a Facebook page to get our messages out. The best companies are not saying so much it's about getting our messages out. The best companies, to me, are saying it's about getting stories from the community. And this is an example, a small example. And in the book, by the way, one of the things I really wanted to do was not use big-name companies. Companies with big budgets, companies with sexy brands. I didn't want to talk about Apple Computer and Sony and Nike. I wanted to take a lot of examples and a lot of stories that show you that anybody can do this. With a small budget, with a small group with a small marketing team, with not pumping resources into it, and not with a well-known brand. And an example that I found is this company called MyDeco. MyDeco sells things for the home. They help you find the best prices on furnishings for your home. But it's not about selling furnishing for the home, to me. It's about creating a community that's passionate about design. And that's what this company's been able to do. They get people to send in their stories of how they decorate their rooms. They challenge people. They get a professional designer and they say, here's how this famous designer designed a bedroom. Use our interactive design tools and show us what you would do with a bedroom. So they get people sharing their stories in those ways, in very simple ways. Yeah. Okay. Another point I like to make is that I think it's really the beginning of storytelling. It's about listening. And we have the tools to do it today. You know, there are people, I worked with companies that they follow their blogs, you know, and there are lots of people out there blogging about a lot of things. They follow what's happening on the social sites. They follow Twitter, and it's mostly about listening. Mostly about listening to see what your community and your potential community is concerned about and talking about. So I like this quote too. In order to speak, one must first listen. Learn to speak by listening. And it was true in the 13th century when Rumi said it, and it's true today. And I think we forget that sometimes. I think we think too much about getting our messages out and not enough about listening to our groups, our constituents, our clients, our communities. Okay? So, great example of a company that I found that's doing this. This is a company that happens to be near where I live in the south of France. And it's called Maton. Maton sells pots and pans. And I think that's not very glamorous. And the marketing manager at Maton often gets up and says, you know, I'm from a company that sells pots and pans. And he really low-keys this thing. This company has done great things, integrating social media, email, and storytelling. So how does a company that sells pots and pans develop this community? And they really have a buzzing community, Facebook page, website. First thing they do is they send out an email. They started just with a pretty good email list of their clients and prospects. They sent out an email and said, we'd like to invite you to join our Facebook page and become a fan. If you're a fan of us or if you're a fan of cooking, okay, come join us. And what happened was very interesting. They sent out this email, and in 48 hours, they had 10,000 fans on their Facebook page. But even more than that, they had a lot of people who said, thank you for the invitation. I would really like to belong to something. What does this tell us? This kind of tells us that people really want to belong, and they want to belong to a group of people who shares their passion. Now, obviously, the passion isn't for the pots and pans. The passion is for all the things they do with the pots and pans. So what do? They exchange their stories. They're passionate about cooking. And in France, this has worked very well, and I think it would work in many places. But in France, everybody has a story about a recipe. You know, this is the way my mother made it. This is the way we do it in our restaurant. And everybody has a regional variation on those things. So people exchange recipes, exchange stories, and they have a buzzing Facebook page. And I keep coming back to this. You know, if a company that makes pots and pans can have a buzzing community, then I think anybody can do it. And that's the kind of thing I wanted to show in this book. Most important story, we think about telling our story. The thing we want to think about is triggering stories for the community and in the community. So the most important story is not the one we tell, it's the one we generate in the mind of the listener. And I think that's a really important thing to keep in mind. What you want to do is get the community thinking, yeah, I have a story like that, and I could exchange that and contribute that. Those kinds of things. And a company that's done this really well is Filofax. And again, I wanted to find companies that did ordinary things from daily life. This is not an ordinary company, but it's a company that does something ordinary. They make organizers, you know, paper organizers, where you keep your addresses and your calendar and things like that. What they've been able to do, and what we've been able to do with them, is help them tap into the passion around being organized or having this object or whatever. And they do all kinds of interesting things. One of the things that they do is they have contests. Tell us a story about your first Filofax. And even I was amazed at this. People write in things about how they felt when they got their first Filofax, how it made them feel. And we discovered a lot of passion around this item. One of the other things we did was we said, well, tell us a story this month about a time you thought you lost your Filofax, and a time somebody gave it back to you, or a time you thought it was lost or you did lose it or whatever. The theme was the lost Filofax. And the passion that came out of that was just incredible. And the interesting thing is, you can tap in, just about anybody can tap in to passion in a related activity or an ancillary activity. And when I thought about it, I think, you know, everybody does this. Nike doesn't get people talking about their stories about how technically great their running shoes are. They get people telling stories about how it makes them feel. So, how did you feel when you lose your Filofax was a very interesting kind of storytelling campaign.